Um, so no matter where we might be around the country, I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. I want to thank everyone for coming, and it's obvious from the response that there's real genuine interest from in particular students here at the ANU in this fascinating and beautiful region that we study here at the Centre for Arab and Islamic Studies. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the three panellists who I expect will be well known to many of you. Dr. Rayhan Ismail, Dr. Kirill Nurjanov, and Associate Professor Karima Lashir, who it's my pleasure to hand over to momentarily to make some introductory remarks in her capacity as Director of the Centre for Arab and Islamic Studies at the ANU. Thanks, Karima.
Right. First of all, thank you everyone for coming. It's a huge pleasure for us to host you all in this special seminar on COVID-19 and its repercussions in the Middle East and Central Asia. It's intended to be, as it is organized by SARI, as a forum for us to exchange ideas, expertise, and answer your questions. So it's really a very interactive forum. I would like to start first of all by thanking Sally Davis, who has done a wonderful job in organizing this event, and also Marcus James, Anita Mack, and all colleagues in CASE, and also Bobby from CAS Learning Communities, who's been fantastic in mobilizing us to get this event together. So thank you all very much. Now, today, I must say, is a very special day in majority Muslim countries in the Middle East and Central Asia, because it is, or it may be, the last day of Ramadan. So this weekend we'll see the biggest religious celebrations in this region, which is the celebrations of Eid al-Fitr. So in a sense, it's quite a special day for everybody. And it's a moment also to reflect on how people coped with Ramadan, and again, how they will cope with the Eid celebration without that togetherness that kind of mark these religious festivities. Now, let me start by saying that COVID-19 pandemic has brought the globe to a shared moment of pause. And I hope it's a pause that allows us to reflect on our unsustainable lifestyles and the damages we have been causing to the environment. Also, it highlighted the sharp inequalities around the world and the fact that we share the planet. We do share the planet, and we should think and act collectively to protect it, rather than act unilaterally. And I think we've seen more of the unilateral action than the collective one in this current crisis. Now, with lockdowns all over the world, a looming economic recession, job losses, and unemployment around the world, and of course the threat of death, which is all around us, the globe is facing serious challenges that require collective thinking, empathy, and solidarity. As rich countries in the Northern Hemisphere, who have been the worst hit with COVID-19 deaths, are emerging slowly, albeit quite uncertainly, from lockdowns, we're told by the WHO in the last 2 days that the virus is still spreading in the global south, in poorer countries in Asia and Africa, which are less equipped to deal with the pandemic. Up to date, many poorer and middle income nations have at least largely been spared the carnage of wealthier countries, which is largely due to mainly to two questions: the question of demographics. The Northridge have older population. The global South have younger population, and we know that COVID-19 affected mostly older population, and also to travel and mobility. The global South cannot afford to travel and move as much as the North. We've also seen quite in a fascinating way how some strong health system around the world didn't guarantee better responses to virus. We witnessed how the responses were all about questions of leadership and the kind of communications certain countries had with their nations. And I must say New Zealand come at the top in our list. It's true that the challenges of COVID-19 are novel. It's a deadly new virus that has brought the globe to a standstill. However, I think we will all agree that the responses to the pandemic from various states around the world suggest that they are not new and are similar to past political and economic events that came before COVID-19. And these responses include securitization, heightened surveillance, and the aggravation of forms of violence, particularly against women and minorities. And I think the case of India and violence against Muslims in India is quite a stark example. We're all confronted by decades of structural inequalities generated by the adoption of neoliberal economic models in rich and middle and poor income countries, and how the way the state has given up on offering or providing basic public health services like education and healthcare, and how they've been handed over to the private sector, has created immense gaps between the rich and the poor, who don't have similar access to these basic services. We've also witnessed how COVID-19 has ravaged some of the most powerful countries in the world, including the US, Britain, France, Spain, and Italy, which currently account for 70% of all deaths. And again, have highlighted the inequalities within these countries themselves. As scholars in critical humanities and social sciences, we want to highlight the specificity of the Middle East and Central Asia and the repercussions of COVID-19 pandemic on state-society relations. Now, our point of view is that the Middle East and Central Asia are specific, but they are not exceptional. And therefore, the aim here is for critical humanities and social sciences to be regioned, i.e. our need to pursue these questions from a Middle East and Central Asian perspectives and realities. Some of the questions we would like to highlight today is, what do the range of state responses to COVID-19 pandemic reveal about their respective underlying social contract in the Middle East and Central Asia? And how has the pandemic interacted with ongoing social and political struggles? And what political spaces has it closed down and perhaps also opened up? So, of course, we must take into account the huge geographical diversity as well as the economic and political divides in these two interconnected regions. So I'll reflect overall on the Arabic-speaking Middle East, and my colleague Kirill will focus on Central Asia. My colleague Raihan will focus on Egypt, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. And luckily we have with us our new colleague in case, Dr. Alam Saleh, who can also help us with questions on Iran. So that's really good luck. Then we will open up the discussion and get questions and answer them with the audience. My point of focus would really be on the economic question and how COVID-19 has aggravated the existing inequalities in the region. And my argument is that this will create more social upheaval and I think more mobilizing on the part of the people to take up to the street. So this is the outlining argument I'm pushing this afternoon. So the situation is different for the richer Arab Gulf countries, developing economies from the Levant and North Africa, and the conflict-affected and war-torn countries such as Libya, Yemen, and Syria. So we have to differentiate between these three categories of countries. Of course, also we have to highlight that the region is home to some of the largest refugee camps in the world, with displaced people living in crowded and hygienic settings with no access to basic health services, and they remain largely and extremely vulnerable to the pandemic. They're not even part of the state planning in some places like Jordan and Turkey. They're not even part of the planning. They're not even considered as part of the population of these countries. And these, of course, include large number of Syrians, Iraqis, Yemenis, who've been displaced because of the wars in these regions. Now, overall responses to COVID-19 by MENA countries varied from delayed, inadequate, and fragmented response, such as that of Iran and Turkey, which have become the epicenter of the spread of the virus in the region. And they both prioritized the question of economy over the health of their populations for various complex regions to do with the geopolitics in the two countries and failing economies and the way they wanted to divert attention from that, but we can discuss that more during Q&A. And also Egypt, whose government response has been also dismal and has focused more on the economy rather than the state. But I guess Raihan will talk explore further that question. Other countries such as the Arab Gulf states, Jordan, Morocco, and Tunisia have been ahead of the curve, taking preemptive measures to minimize infections, and in some countries, these measures were forced by the military and security apparatuses. Again, raising questions about the violent social contract they have this with their nations. And we've seen various videos on social media of the army intervening in these countries to enforce curfews in a very aggressive and sometimes very violent way. Again, war ravaged Syria, Libya, and Yemen, whose health system have been destroyed by the wars, remain largely helpless in the face of the pandemic and extremely vulnerable as well. Currently, most MENA countries are under a partial or complete lockdown with the closure of non-essential businesses, religious centers, and other public venues. And with the end of the holy month of Ramadan this weekend and the celebrations of Eid al-Fitr, some countries have even implemented more restrictions on social gatherings to minimize infections. Again, going back to the question of the stark differences economically between these countries, in the 6 rentiers oil-rich Gulf Arab states, the governments have been very generous with their citizens and offered through the redistribution of oil rent protection against job losses. And offered again some form of cushion or social security for its citizens. And this is despite the fact that the oil prices have fallen sharply. But again, we have to remember that these countries have some good deep reserves that they can fall back to. But for how long, that's a question that we need to discuss. But the arrangement also revealed the level of inequalities in these countries, as current reports indicate that the worst hit population are the low-income foreign laborers who came to the region looking for work to support their families back home. I mean, usually they come from predominantly, these are the South Asians, the Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, and Indians, and some poorer Arabs like the Egyptian, Syrians, or Moroccan. And they usually work in construction, hospitality, retail, and other sectors. I mean, recent reports have shown that they have high rate of infections. There is a high rate of infections among these foreign workers, mainly because of the fact that they don't have access to healthcare, and also their living conditions are horrific. They live in very crowded apartment or blocks that doesn't allow at all social distances. And also they have suffered immensely because of these job losses. Their countries are not helping them. There is the kind of an attempt to reparate them back or take them back to their countries. But the actions of both India and Pakistan have been extremely slow. And of course, these laborers cannot afford tickets to fly back. And there is also restrictions on flights. So it's largely the poor and the privileged who are affected by COVID-19. And this is something that is not specific to the Gulf Arab states. We've noticed that also in the rich north with high rates of death among African American population in America, in the US, and ethnic minorities in the UK, or the poor, the working classes in the UK. So it's not something that is unique to the region. Again, going back to the question of the economics or the political economy of the region, and just to try and explain where it comes from, the idea that it's the underprivileged or the poor who are mainly suffering, it's because of the limited number of formal private employment and how informal precarious employment is the dominant form of employment in the region, which is usually associated with lack of social protection and low and unstable revenues, and which makes informal workers particularly vulnerable in the face of these crises. And of course, this includes low productivity jobs requiring physical presence with no possibility to work remotely or to work from home. And so the restrictions of COVID-19 have put a strain on informal workers' activity, who are faced with the dilemma of either compliance with the health measures or total loss of income and hunger, or being thrown in the streets because they can't afford rent or food. Some states in the region, particularly in North Africa, like Morocco and Tunisia, created some basic social security funds for the poor and underprivileged, but access to them remain really limited and marred with corruption. We've seen, for example, in Morocco, various protests by people in different parts of Morocco, particularly in deep Morocco, in rural areas, asking for access to the money, which again is not automatic, or it's really marked by that echelon of authority that doesn't allow the poor to access this fund. In Tunisia, the situation, of course, is much better because the government was elected in February, so there is a high legitimacy there, and there was no backlash from the population. So the social contract is much more progressive than other places. But again, the overall question I want to raise here is the stark inequalities in the region, which are further exacerbated by COVID-19. And this may lead to serious social upheavals in the coming months. Women, of course, are doubly affected by COVID-19 because they are overrepresented in informal precarious employment, and because of their duties of care towards children and the elderly in predominantly patriarchal society. And of course, many women work in the healthcare, particularly as nurses, so that's put them at the forefront of getting infections. There's also the question that I would like to raise as well, and I don't have time to elaborate more, is the issue of generations of young people of lower working class and poor backgrounds who are not receiving any education at the moment because nothing has been put in place to replace the shutdown of state school and universities. Of course, in the rich Arab Gulf states, there is some form of online learning because people there can afford computers, laptops, and internet. But in the big poor Arab states like Egypt and Morocco, it's very much something that is confined to upper middle classes. So the majority are still not having any form of access to education, which has again further repercussions in widening the gap in terms of skills and aggravating social and economic inequalities. Again, governments in the region have used COVID-19 to impose more restrictions on freedom of expressions and to target dissenters directly or indirectly. We've seen that in Egypt with the arrest of journalists. We've seen that in Algeria and in various other countries. In fact, COVID-19 lockdowns have disrupted or were used by some states to disrupt some important protest movements in the region, including in Algeria, in Lebanon, and Iraq, where protesters were forced off the streets after months of mass protest. They were mainly calling for change. So governments in these three countries, in Algeria, Lebanon, and Iraq, made use of COVID-19 lockdown to impose strict restrictions and penalties on public gatherings. However, I think protesters, and I've seen lots of social media exchanges there, will resume in these countries, as we've been promised in Iraq and Lebanon. They're just putting a halt on them, but they will come back and they will carry on protesting against corruption of the ruling elites, stark inequalities, lack of access to basic services, and of course the two countries, Iraq and Lebanon, sectarian political systems. In Algeria, the government has also instrumentalized coronavirus-related restrictions to deliberately silence internal dissent and target journalists and dissenters. I've been even following the fact that the Algerian government have stopped some comic shows that make fun of the government and the corruption in the country. So it even touches various other different parts of civil society. So overall, just to sum up my point, the repercussion of COVID-19, in fact, might galvanize more forces to join mass political protest in the coming months, demanding justice and equality. And that's the end of my intervention there. Thank you all for listening, and I'll pass the parole, as they say in French, to Rayhan.
Thank you so much, Karima, for that wonderful overview. I will be looking at some of the issues that you've raised as well, but within the framework of Egypt, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. So I have my presentation here, so I hope you're going to be able, you're able to actually see it. Is it visible?
Yeah.
Perfect. Excellent. So basically, I think, as I've said, I'll be touching on some of the issues that you've raised. I will be looking at 3 issues when examining these countries. I think, the idea or the issue of transparent reporting and handling of cases, healthcare and social services in the 3 countries, and also the issue of repression amid the outbreak. And I think that's something that you've actually mentioned as well. So, but we'll be looking at Egypt, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia more specifically. So when we look at Egypt, it has an autocratic and non-transparent government. How did that reflect its response to COVID-19? So that's definitely a question that I'm hoping to be able to answer. So the country registered its first case in February, and the Egyptian government was initially reluctant to acknowledge COVID-19 cases and underreported the number of cases. And as Karima mentioned earlier, Egyptian authorities sought to muzzle journalists and doctors from speaking out about the spread of COVID-19. We know that Egypt forced Ruth Michelson, a Guardian journalist, to leave the country. Ruth reported a study from the Lancet Infectious Diseases Journal, which looked at traveling records, flight details, and infection rates. And the study estimated that Egypt could have had between 6,000 to 19,000 coronavirus cases by early March. At the time, the Egyptian government had recorded only 3 cases. So if you look at the WHO, also reported that Egypt had the capacity to conduct 200,000 tests, but the government failed or reluctant to do so. So Egyptian television hosts, for example, downplayed COVID-19. Some of them even suggested herbal remedies and arguing that the superiority of Egyptians would actually shield them from the virus. So the state imposed social distancing restrictions that were, to a large extent, according to analysts, were useless to contain the virus. The curfew introduced begins at 9 p.m. and lasts until 6 a.m. And in the past 2 months, Egypt has seen a rising number of registered cases. And today, it has more than 13,000 confirmed cases and almost 700 deaths. However, many analysts, as I've said earlier, doubt the accuracy of this figure as testing remains extremely limited and contact tracing is not enforced at all. And despite the rise of reported cases, the Egyptian government has eased social restrictions that were never properly enforced anyway. So Egypt sees more than 1 million metro passengers daily. You can see some of them wearing masks. That's very expensive in Egypt at the moment. Travelers returning from Egypt were initially required to self-isolate for 2 weeks, often in cramped places, including the airport. Now, the Egyptian government has reduced quarantine to 7 days because it can no longer keep returning travelers for 14 days. So if you look at quarantine facilities as well, they are overcrowded. Many deaths are not registered as COVID-related, and this is according to some medical doctors who have been arrested, by the way. So heart conditions, pneumonia, as well as organ failure are nominated as reasons for deaths instead of COVID-19. So the lack of transparency and a clear message from government officials of the dangers of COVID-19 affects people's behavior as well, as they don't adhere to social distancing rules because you don't know that it's dangerous. Many people, when asked, they said, "Oh, I don't know, I'm not sure what's happening." People are wearing masks, as I've said earlier, but often congregate in crowded places. So if you look at Kuwait, which is another example, I'm trying to look at, transparency in terms of reporting and transparent reporting and handling of cases. Kuwait has been hailed as an example of effective handling of the coronavirus. The Kuwaiti government followed the South Korean model. It conducted massive testing. It also tried to enforce contact tracing to ensure the containment of the virus. So from the very beginning, the Kuwaiti government took the threat of COVID-19 seriously. Kuwait learned from its past experience of handling MERS and tried to be as prepared as possible. So the state enforced social distancing, at first encouraging people to work from home, but gradually introduced more restrictions. So the government implemented a full curfew from the 10th of May until the end of May. So from mid-March, prayer congregations were cancelled. And what's interesting, for the first time in centuries, the call to prayer was actually altered. Instead of saying, Hayya ala salah, come to prayer, it was changed to as-salatu fi buyutikum, which means pray in your homes. And Saudi Arabia took a similar approach to Kuwait. However, it registered more COVID-19 cases than Kuwait. It has the highest number of recorded cases among GCC countries, with more than 60,000 cases confirmed. And you have to consider the size of the country as well. Kuwait is actually much smaller in population in comparison to Saudi Arabia. But when you look at Saudi Arabia, the country also acted swiftly after the first cases were recorded. Travel bans were enforced. Saudi students stranded in Wuhan were repatriated and quarantined. So the Saudi government, with the endorsement of the religious establishment, suspended Umrah, which is the lesser pilgrimage, which can be performed anytime during the year. So like Kuwait, the call to prayers were also altered, and come to prayer was changed to as-salatu fi buyutikum as well. So when we look at healthcare and social services, so that's the second point that I would like to tackle today. Kuwait has recorded, as I've said earlier, more than 100 deaths, and Saudi Arabia has recorded more than 300 deaths. The number could be higher, but they are largely reliable. Egypt, on the other hand, has registered more than 600 deaths, but analysts believe that the number is actually understated. And Kuwait and Saudi Arabia have a better healthcare system, as Karima mentioned earlier. They have a better healthcare system with adequate hospital emergency services, and Egypt had a crumbling healthcare system even before the outbreak of the coronavirus. There are unverified reports that the state or state services are on the brink of collapsing due to COVID-19. Hospitals are unable to cope with the number of COVID-19 cases, and the number of hospitals have had to close due to high rate of staff infection. So many Egyptians, for example, have taken to social media, and this is where social media has played an important role in highlighting some of the problems. Of course, you are not going to be able to verify everything, but many Egyptians have taken to social media demanding assistance as ambulances are unavailable, and people were literally dying at home while being recorded by relatives. If you look at healthcare workers as well, many of them have demanded better protection and support on social media, arguing that the state is not interested in protecting them. Personal protective equipment is not available. And what is outrageous for many Egyptians is the state trying to project power by broadcasting its efforts to help China, Italy, and the US by sending them personal protective equipment and other medical supplies. So that's part of the propaganda video that you can see on the slide. So poorer countries have less capacity to impose and enforce social restrictions. Egypt continues to demonstrate reluctance to slow down its economy. Already it is easing the social restrictions and pledging to open its economy fully soon. As mentioned earlier, Kuwait is in a better position. Although like other countries, COVID-19 will impact its economy for sure. Small businesses in particular have struggled to survive. Again, in terms of services, Kuwait has done well for its citizens, but there are brewing problems with containing the spread of the virus. And Karima mentioned earlier about the issue of foreign laborers, and I think this is a major problem in the context of Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, and what's the other Gulf country? Yes, you know what I mean, the other, yes. So the issue of foreign laborers has created human rights concerns in Kuwait. So GCC countries such as Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and Qatar, as I've said earlier, have always struggled with the question of migrant workers and their ill treatment anyway. If you look at Kuwait, some prominent Kuwaitis have actually demanded that the government deport migrant workers. So famous Kuwaiti actress Hayat al-Fahad has called for foreign workers to be kicked out from the country. Some Kuwaitis supported her while other Kuwaitis were appalled, with many reminding everyone to maintain their humanity. So Kuwait, we know, has always struggled with the issue of undocumented migrant workers. So to ensure that they are able to curb the spread of COVID-19, the government decided to grant an amnesty for undocumented laborers in April. Many of them surrendered themselves and were transferred to detention camps in the desert just outside Kuwait City, awaiting repatriation. Unfortunately, many have been stranded in these camps under appalling conditions. They are unable to practice social distancing, they have very limited access to water and food, and they are living in overcrowded spaces. So the Kuwaiti government is actually working at the moment with India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and Egypt, but the process of repatriation of both documented and undocumented workers has been slow. In fact, there are reports that a number of workers have died in these camps for unknown reasons. So many countries are reluctant to take their workers back. I think Karima mentioned that earlier. Although they have long relied on remittances sent home by these laborers, now they're not appreciated anymore, I suppose. The same can be said about Saudi Arabia. The country offered amnesty to undocumented workers, but migrant worker accommodation again makes social distancing and hygienic practices almost impossible. So this is a pressing issue. I know we've looked at Singapore, and Singapore was once hailed as an excellent example of a country that has, or that managed to contain the spread of COVID-19. However, the country saw a rising number of COVID-19 cases after it failed to take the plight of migrant workers seriously. And I think Kuwait and Saudi Arabia are actually looking at the Singaporean example and learning a lot from the Singaporean example. You can't afford to have blind spots in dealing with the virus. So the final issue that I'll be looking at is, the idea or the issue of repression. So before that, that's one of the pictures of the Kuwait's detention camps in the deserts for migrant workers. So if you look at the issue of repression, COVID-19 has also presented an opportunity for more repression in the region. And some autocratic rulers have taken advantage of the situation. In Egypt, we know that local journalists have been arrested for spreading rumors regarding COVID-19. The Egyptian authorities have also extended pre-trial detention of political prisoners without permitting them to appear before a judge. And many of them are languishing in Egyptian prisons. So there are estimated 60,000 political prisoners in Egypt. So human rights activists and lawyers have called for their release amid the outbreak. Very few have been released. Many are still languishing in overcrowded prison under squalid conditions. There are calls to free political prisoners in Saudi Arabia as well, as the country has arrested many activists in the past few years. Again, the call has fallen on deaf ears. In fact, those who have raised the issue of prisoner release amid the COVID-19 outbreak have themselves been targeted by the state and arrested. So basically, we're looking at, as Karima mentioned earlier, there are Kuwait and Saudi Arabia have the capacity to actually deal with COVID-19 better than Egypt, but there are definitely issues that we have to keep an eye and we have to watch out for. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rayhan. We're going to pass over to Kirill Nazhanov now, and he's going to be talking a little bit about some of the mysteries that are unfolding in Central Asia. So over to Kirill.
All right, thanks, Sally, and I appreciate the effort, the spade work my colleagues have just done for me. And can you see my slide?
Oh, you got to share screen.
Yeah, I'm sharing a screen now. Yep.
Yep, happy.
All right. So, and the more I listened to Rayhan and Karima, the more I thought that history repeats itself once again in Central Asia, and just like during the days of the Arab Spring in 2010 and 2011, Central Asia seems to be kind of moving away from the pattern set by Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia, and the social contract in Central Asia seems to be a bit more robust and inured to fracture than in the Middle East. And I don't want to start a third world war, but it strikes me all the time that people in Central Asia often comment on just this divergence, that somehow we in Central Asia are superior to our Muslim brothers in the Arab world. We're a bit more organized, a bit more tolerant, a bit more efficient. Of course, this is just a matter of speculation, but maybe there's something in this, I don't know. Maybe Central Asia is just luckier than the Arab world, and some of the statistics about COVID and the extent of the pandemic in the region may provide the validation to this highly speculative point. Because if you have a look at these quite crudely drawn graphs, then you'll see that Central Asia has not been that badly affected, or at least until now. The levels of infection are, well, they're high, but not exorbitant, and the levels of death are also quite well, minimal compared to some other countries. And I often tell my students that if you want to have a comparative country to Kazakhstan, for example, the largest territory in Central Asia, use Australia, because well, Australia is girt by sea, Kazakhstan is girt by land, but otherwise, in terms of the size of the population, in terms of the area, Kazakhstan is just slightly smaller than Australia. Kazakhstan is, of course, poorer than Australia, but it is a middle-income country, and it has been setting an example in how to deal with the pandemic, at least in the region. So the COVID virus arrived in Central Asia in early March, and Kazakhstan was quick off the mark, you know, deploying all the right measures, the 3 types of response. And the rate of new infections has decelerated considerably, and basically, I think Kazakhstan has just turned the corner. Please keep in mind that there's a 45-day gap between Australia and Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan will have what we have in Australia right now, maybe in mid-July. So with those thoughts in mind, I would like to simply share with you some of the observations I've been making about the Central Asian countries. It's not necessarily a comprehensive rundown, it's just what struck my imagination and I found quite exciting as a political scientist. So indeed, what happened in Kazakhstan in recent weeks and months was an exercise in power machinations by the incumbent president of the country, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. He most certainly used the COVID emergency to solidify his grip on power. But it was not about controlling the toiling masses, as it were. It was overcoming a rival faction within the elite. And of course, one of the casualties in this elite struggle in Kazakhstan was the dismissal of the daughter of the previous president, the foundation president of Kazakhstan, Dariga Nazarbayeva, from the very important position as the chair of the Senate. So Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, by all metrics, has been viewed as a strong leader in the time of the pandemic in Kazakhstan, and the social contract appears to be holding reasonably well. especially given that just like in Australia, the government of Kazakhstan has been taking active measures to prop up the economy and to alleviate poverty and suffering by the people. So thus, as far as I can see, Kazakhstan is muddling through quite all right. The big question, of course, is how long will this adipose fat of savings will last, and for how long the government of Kazakhstan will be able to continue those payouts and spend billions of dollars on propping up the struggling economy. If we move on to Uzbekistan, it's the most populous country in Central Asia. It's poorer than Kazakhstan, and it had its own know-how, the life hack, so to speak, how to deal with the coronavirus. And what indeed captured my imagination was that the authoritarian president of Uzbekistan, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, decided to devolve at least some controlling functions over the COVID unpleasantness to low-ranking societal institutions. So in Uzbekistan, they are known as the Mahalla committees, so neighborhood watch kind of organizations, usually presided over by a committee of elders. And Shavkat Mirziyoyev in March of this year said, well, hey, people of Uzbekistan, citizens, it's really up to you to self-police and to self-educate and make sure that this bloody virus does not spread any further than necessary. And what was absolutely mesmerizing and a lesson in how strategic communication should be done by an authoritarian president, he shifted the blame to the community before enjoining the community to clean up the mess. So in a very memorable speech, he accused a woman from Uzbekistan, from the Fergana Valley, who went on a small pilgrimage, the Umrah to Mecca, came back and threw in a mother of all parties, inviting 120 guests. And she was infected and she passed on the germs to others. And Mirziyoyev said, well, it's not on, it's against our national tradition to behave in such an irresponsible manner. So you people in the Mahalla committee, you must make it stop. So Uzbekistan, just like Kazakhstan, seems to have turned the corner. Well, there is some divergence in the rates of infection. Some regions do better than others. But on the whole, the government of Uzbekistan has begun to relax some of the quarantine measures. Again, for me, the big question, the big challenge that Uzbekistan is going to face in the next month is the economic situation in the country. Its sovereign wealth fund is not as big as Kazakhstan's. Uzbekistan spent only about 1/10 of Kazakhstan did on social protection measures. It did borrow some money from the international market, but it will run out soon. And what I picked up in the chatter on social media in Uzbekistan, that there is this underlying concern that food may run out as well, because Uzbekistan is not self-sufficient in some commodities, rice and wheat, for example, they have to be imported, and other countries in the region are erecting barriers and are stopping the export of such goods to Uzbekistan. But I'm sure such problems will be manageable in the end of the day. If we go to Kyrgyzstan, yet another variation in the strategy of dealing with COVID and maintaining the social contract intact in the process. To give full credit to the government in Kyrgyzstan, it's labeled as authoritarian by various institutions, but its polity is much more diversified and open than elsewhere in Central Asia, and there has been an open public discussion on what we should do, what we should not do in this time of national emergency. And the president of the country actually, again, projected the image of a strong leader, sacked underperforming ministers, and advised the nation, look, guys, we're screwed up. We're a poor country, we don't have the development of Uzbekistan or the resources of Kazakhstan. We have to go around hat in hand and ask the international community for assistance. And for the first time in many years, in a couple of decades, Kyrgyzstan went to the International Monetary Fund and said, well, give us money. And the IMF obliged, and that helps Kyrgyzstan to tide the emergency over to some extent. At least salaries of public servants are paid to some degree by international money coming from outside the country. What is a big issue now in Kyrgyzstan, and what erodes the social contract at the moment and potentially can destabilize the polity there, is the issue of the labor migrants. Just like Raihan advised in the case of Kuwait, they are in a predicament. They lost their jobs in Russia mostly, and they cannot return home. The figures are not known, but we are talking about tens of thousands of people who assault, the Kyrgyz embassy in Moscow, trying to figure ways to come back home. But even if they come back home, what do they have to face? There is no work. There's a lot of quarantine restriction around, and this may boil over into some kind of public protest. And from our viewpoint, what is quite fascinating is that Kyrgyzstan, that for 6 years has been the most ardent supporter of the Eurasian Economic Union, a regional economic organization, has been developing second thoughts about the utility of this equivalent of the European Union in Eurasia. And the parallels can be built with the rising tide of nationalism in Italy or some other European countries that, well, what is this supranational organization is doing for us to help us with COVID? In Kyrgyzstan, these questions are asked, and they're asked in the street, they're asked on the floor of the parliament, and it does not really augur well for the well-being of the EU. Then let's have a brief look at Tajikistan. I'm sure that you noticed that of all the Central Asian republics, it exhibited the most dramatic exponential growth in the number of infections, infected people, and the number of deaths. It's simply because the leadership of the country pursued the policy of masterly inactivity, did not admit the presence of infected people until very late, about a month and a half later than other Central Asian republics, and now they are reaping the bitter harvest that the pandemic situation is getting out of hand, and there are not enough intensive care units or ventilators, and it's like reliving the nightmare that we had in Australia in February this year. What really begs imagination is that as late as the 21st of March, there were massive public gatherings, celebrations, and festivals. And of course, the marvel of the world for a little while was the Tajik Professional Football League. Everywhere else, soccer was suspended. In Tajikistan, it continued, and well, betting agencies and global networks focused on the semi-amateurish Tajik Professional League until even it had to be closed down just a few days ago. So thus Tajikistan alone in the Central Asian countries faces a life and death kind of medical crisis, but economic problems are just over the horizon because it's the weakest of the Central Asian economies. Just like Kyrgyzstan, it relies on remittances, and they have been drying up because there is no more work for Tajik labor migrants in Russia. Finally, and this is an enigma wrapped in a mystery stuffed on the top of an Akhalteke horse, we simply don't know what's going on in Turkmenistan. The official line is that even today it's COVID-free, and there are very few countries in the world that can boast such achievement. It's North Korea really, and a couple of small island nations. We don't know whether it's true or not true, but the president of the country says, yep, swear, cross my heart and swear to die, but it's true, we're so special, we don't have the virus. Business continues as usual. Apparently in Turkmenistan, public parades are held, and in the meantime, the World Health Organization experts are banned, are prevented from going to Turkmenistan and validating the story of the super authoritarian president that we are clean as a whistle. So just to round it up, this quite superficial summary, and again, it's obvious to me that Central Asia has gone a bit lucky so far. and there is no really evidence that the people are about to rise. And just finishing on the note that Karima said, she made a very important point that a lot of authoritarian leaders these days take advantage of the situation to increase surveillance, to constrict civic freedoms. Central Asia may not be an exception, except there is no public outcry against this. People cop it on the chin. In Kyrgyzstan, where the Chinese have implemented the so-called Safe City program, it's cameras in the capital city, Bishkek, there are no street demonstrations or picket lines saying, well, down with this totalitarian machine of electronic surveillance, it's good for us. People agree. Even taxi drivers who are usually grumpy say, well, it's necessary. So again, for me, it shows that the social contract in Central Asia between the rulers and the ruled is a bit more supple than in some of the Arab countries, and can just muddle through the worst month of the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kirill. What we'll do now, that is absolutely exceptional timing. It's 4 o'clock, so round of applause. We are going to now have questions. And I've got some trickling in, some particularly interesting questions. First of all, what I might start out with is just to each of you in particular, if you could tell us one thing that's really surprised you about this pandemic, in how states have responded, like one thing that's really stood out for you, that the crisis has revealed in the regions you study.
Well, I'm unmuted, I may as well start. And yes. My particular passion in Central Asia is reserved for Tajikistan. And nobody can fathom why President Rahmon has delayed the recognition of the problem for so long. And there are lots of conspiracy theories, starting with the president's personal drinking habits and ranging all the way to ploy to ease his son into the position of an official successor. It just doesn't work in my mind, but it's a mystery, and it's flying against the trend for no apparent reason at all. So I probably spent several weeks trying to figure it out for myself. Maybe there'll be a publication arising out of this. I find it really exciting.
I can go second. I'm genuinely impressed with Tunisia. It's not surprising. I'm impressed because I think the country is representing a model of hope in the region. There seems to be a kind of a consensus built on how to deal with COVID-19, mainly because there's a new government that was voted for in February and had a wide public appeal. And I think the people have cooperated really well with the restrictions, and the way the government handled the situation seems to me like a model of hope in the region. I'm deeply depressed and surprised at Algeria. I must admit. The other countries don't really surprise me as much as Algeria, which has a very, just before the COVID-19, there was a mass protest happening in the countries that, as you all know, have toppled down the previous president, the alien president, replaced by another one. Again, the same elite, the military cadaver and all that. But the country is really on the verge of a collapse on all levels, but they didn't lift a finger to cater or accommodate the needs of the nation. And this is a country that is presumably quite oil rich, so they have the reserves. And the way they reacted to the demands of the people is the most depressing. They haven't started any form of social security fund, or so I think it's an explosive situation, and I'm genuinely puzzled at the lack of reaction. These are the two countries that stand out for me.
I would say that the crisis for me has only magnified existing problems. I think COVID-19 exposes regional inequality, as we know, and the lack of collective action, as Karima mentioned earlier, regionally, as countries focus on state-centric solutions to the pandemic. I think we are looking at Yemen at the moment. It is on the brink of being wiped out due to famine, war, and now COVID-19. The region and the world has abandoned the country and its people. But on a positive note, I think religious institutions in some countries, including Egypt, have taken leadership roles in educating the population. Although the Egyptian government was slow to act, Al-Azhar University, which is the bastion of Sunni Islam, acted before the state and closed its campus. So we've seen how Saudi clerics and Kuwaiti clerics were flexible in dealing with COVID-19. So their actions, I would say, undermine the misconceptions that faith and traditions are rigid, and it undermines the misconception that faith and traditions are rigid and inflexible in times of crisis. So I think religious institutions in the region, in particular, have surprised me. Not surprised me, but I think it's a positive thing to note.
Thanks, Rayhan. We have got a very interesting question for Kirill coming up. Okay, so going off the coronavirus caseload and the death toll numbers that are being tracked by Johns Hopkins University, these numbers, we know they're understated in many states, as we mentioned, particularly those states that are recording absolutely nothing. So there seems to be something common for these states that are quite insular, Turkmenistan and obviously North Korea as well. So if we could present Kirill with a counterfactual scenario, say for instance, Turkmenistan admitted to having a large number of infections and deaths, what would happen?
Right. Yeah, I like counterfactuals. I'm a fan of alternative history, science fiction genre. So the what if question is always brain teaser. But first, I think it's highly unlikely simply because, just like in North Korea, the idea of complete isolation, autarky, has been the backbone of state legitimacy in Turkmenistan. They call it neutrality, but neutrality meaning insulation really from absolutely everything that comes from the outside. So if the president of the country admits that something bad came from the outside and made life miserable for us, it would be admitting simply that, look, we cannot live in the insular world, which will deal a blow to legitimacy. But what if indeed the number of casualties mounts to such an extent that the government has to admit the obvious? Even then, I doubt it very much that there'll be the rupture of the social contract, because it's constructed, say, on let's call a spade on tribal lines, and the president is looking after his tribe, and they're the backbone of the security apparatus and the backbone of the economy. They're the lifeblood of the system. And the president, we know this for sure, is looking after them really well, and whatever little bit of information is seeping through from Turkmenistan shows that the president is taking proactive measures, for example, advising wives and children of his trustworthy, well, most trustworthy ministers to go to the country, enjoy an extended holiday and a bit of sunshine. The spring is beautiful in Turkmenistan. So even if there is a disclosure and there are disturbances in the streets, I think the elite, the tribal elite in the service of Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov would be on his side. So the only danger that I anticipate for the social contract and for the regime in Turkmenistan is that it will run out of money and it will run out of food. Anecdotal evidence suggests it's reaching the red line, after which, well, really the popular anger may reach such extent that no amount of elite support would help Berdi Muhamedov. Again, very counterfactual.
Thanks, Kirill. Okay, we've got another one. I don't know if Rayhan might want to take this one. It's about the Gulf monarchies, or any of you, I suppose, could jump in on this. The Gulf monarchies, especially the rentier states, they can often afford not to tax their citizens. We know that, and therefore there's some very loose accountability mechanisms. So do you think a situation like this, where the stream of wealth, being the global demand for the black gold being threatened, is a real vulnerability? And if so, what really are these states doing, such as Saudi, Kuwait, to particularly offset having to impose austerity on their populations?
That's a very good question. I'm not a political economist, so I'm going to try and answer this question, not as a political economist. I think we know with low oil prices and the slowing down of the economy, we've seen countries like Saudi Arabia in particular, struggling to actually maintain services in Saudi Arabia. We're looking at the oil prices as well. There is a possibility that Saudi Arabia will see spending cuts in the public sector. And I think this will limit the country's ability to maintain extensive social welfare during a time of crisis. And I think Saudi Arabia is in a very difficult predicament at the moment. And I think there are already brewing frustration in Saudi Arabia. However, the state is also very repressive in trying to contain frustration in Saudi Arabia. They can't really rely on the oil wealth anymore. So if you look at the private sector in Saudi Arabia, I think it will continue to suffer. It is already struggling, particularly construction and other businesses such as the retail industry will also suffer. And this is, they will cause unemployment and disruption to the country's economic vision. So in the context of Saudi Arabia, I think mega projects will be halted, and this will delay returns of investments that are crucial for Saudi Arabia's economic development. So when you look at this, there are a number of issues that Saudi Arabia will be dealing with, and I think COVID-19 would actually magnify some of the problems. The state will remain its repressive tactics, so I think that's how they're going to deal with growing frustration in Saudi Arabia. So I think COVID-19 is really contributing to that problem. In terms of other Gulf countries, I think the smaller Gulf states would be able to weather this better. The UAE, Kuwait, Qatar in particular, I think these countries have excellent sovereign wealth funds. I think more importantly, their attempts to diversify their economies are on the right track. However, with COVID-19, again, they're going to have to limit, spending or supporting their citizens. But I think these countries would have a better opportunity to actually pacify frustrations or pacify their citizens. So I think it depends, because Saudi Arabia is a different case. It's a much bigger country, but I think the other countries will probably be able to handle this a bit better. How long they can rely on this, I think, or sovereign wealth funds or oil income, I think it's going to be very difficult to say. But I think the attempts to diversify the economies, if successful, would actually provide a better chance for these countries to actually maintain stability.
Thanks, Rayhan. That was a pretty good effort for someone who's not a political economist. Okay, so I've got another question. If this has already been covered, Karima, you forgive me, because it was probably when I was admitting people into the meeting. But what do you think the normative effects will be from authoritarian measures enforcing lockdown? And can you particularly comment on liberal countries like Jordan and Morocco.
Yes, you mean liberal authoritarian countries like Morocco and Jordan.
Yeah,
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
liberal.
I mean, the two countries have been really quick in their response to COVID-19, and they've imposed some of the strictest measures in the region. Very strong lockdowns and curfews that were in a sense, implemented or executed by the security apparatuses, including the army and the police force in the two countries. I mean, these are some of the smartest monarchies in the region. They act swiftly and quickly, and they maintain a liberal image, which doesn't damage the reputations of the monarchs. But in reality, the situation is more complex because I think, particularly in Morocco, after the 2011 uprisings in various regions, the security apparatus was questioned, and its use of force was, in a sense, highly put into test. And I think they were held accountable by their actions. But now we've seen a kind of normalizing of the use of force by the army and the police in the streets of Morocco. And we've seen various instances of people being beaten up, being imprisoned in a very harsh way. So, and the same in Jordan, which is extremely disturbing. In both places, what happened is that there were quick measures taken to protect the two nations from COVID-19. But then later on, they both realized that actually large number of people, actually the majority of the population, cannot afford to stay under lockdown because they survive on daily income by going out to work. And that has created major issues because some of these people were starving. And again, Morocco reacted swiftly by instigating this social security fund to help the poor, and Jordan started distributing food in the streets, but the damage has already been done. In a way or another. So from one perspective, it has again normalized the use of force against citizens, and on the other hand has further exacerbated these inequalities in the two countries. But they still maintain that new liberal image of acting swiftly. I must say, and I think Raihan and Kirill touched on this point, that civil society has been amazing in revealing the violence against citizens in various social media settings. And I've seen a question about the sources of news there in the series of questions we had. I think there were some independent media sources that have, in a sense, played these videos of normal citizens being beaten up and harassed in the street or suffering from hunger and poverty, which is again exposing the regime beyond the usual official channels that Raihan was talking about in the case of Egypt. But at the same time, I think there are many charities, which is again another impressive thing in the region, that have been helping the poor and providing for them. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a couple more. I've just had a few flood in there, but I don't think we're going to have time. I've got one coming up about future elections in the region, if any of you are in a position that you could possibly answer that. The question is, what impact do you see COVID-19 is having on future elections, given that in many areas we're discussing the internet can be unreliable and corruption is a major issue? So in terms of what state we'd actually be referring to, if there's any standout state where you would see any significant change in elections.
Well, can I start? If you don't mind. I think it's all about elections, really. If we approach the situational analysis from the political science viewpoint, what it holds in future for the regimes, well, elections theoretically is the only game in town in Central Asia, and all the governments are going to keep it in mind. The elections are coming up in Kazakhstan next year to the parliament, and riding on his so-called strong response to the pandemic, I believe that Kassym-Jomart Tokayev is going to cash in. First, he may reform the parliament, turn it from the bicameral setup to a unicameral parliament, using the pretext that, look, the Senate, those really quasi-elected officials, tried to torpedo my strong response, my strong leadership by asking difficult questions, unnecessary questions in the time of emergency. So I'm picking up signals from Tokayev and his political party that this may be in the offing, this major reform in Kazakhstan. Of course, the counterexample is Kyrgyzstan, where also elections are going to come up very soon, and the government is being criticized left, right, and center, including by the MPs, and it has to invent something, and that's why it's getting stroppy with the Eurasian Union saying to Putin and other movers and shakers in the organization, unless you give us $250 million now, guess who is going to be in power very soon? Opposition that will be less pro-Russian than it is now. So thus, politics plays a very important part in this COVID calculus all over Central Asia.
Thank you. Well, we're almost ready to round up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pose one very last question. If you could all comment, I suppose, briefly on it. What's your strategy for keeping up with the news and sifting through the sensationalist journalism and misinformation at a time like this?
I have my sources, and I'm not going to diverge them here.
I love the brevity.
We're mainly using academic and non-academic journalistic sources and taking everything with precaution, because we all have biases and positionalities and ideologies. So just reading widely, but without forming opinions based on what's being said in a way. So, but I use a diversity of sources, Western, Arabic, non-Arabic. I usually look for dissident forums where you can get the best information in Arabic as well as in English. Thank you.
I would say in my case, I think I use social media outlets, particularly Twitter, and follow activists in the region. I think it's very difficult to verify some of the reports coming out of the region. I think I saw one this morning saying that the Houthi rebels killing people just to give them a quick death because coronavirus is so horrific, so they just want to make it easy for people. So something like that is going to be very difficult to verify. You don't know whether that is accurate or not accurate. But I think, as Karima said, is about looking at everything possible, particularly non-English sources. Media outlets, traditional media outlets. I have a satellite TV channel at home, so I watch Arab Idol and The Voice and other programs, but also looking at news channels, reporting on what's happening. So most of the time it's government propaganda, but I think it's also quite important to see what the government is saying and what they're presenting as their truth. So I think social media, connecting with some of the activists in the region as well. I think in Saudi and in Egypt, I have a few contacts there. But I think it's really about, getting and collecting information so that you can form your own objective opinion if possible. Sally.
Kirill, I'm unmuting you. You're on mute. That's better.
Yeah, rookie mistake. I would like to simply to reinforce the message from Karima and Raihan that reading sources in vernacular languages is vitally important. There are just so many couch commentators who operate just in the English language. It's not fun, and of course the analysis they produce is often inferior. You have to triangulate your information using various languages.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess what we'll do now is I'm just going to say a few final comments, unless anyone's got anything to add. We've got a couple of minutes to go. I just wanted to say thank you so much to the panelists at this time during the semester, giving up their time that they're supposed to be trying to mark and deal with trying to do the remote learning and everything like that. Your expertise and your insights on this issue at this time is absolutely so valuable to students at CASE in particular, and students of like just international relations, politics, regional studies. I think we've just got to all remember that the science students, they're focused on, or science scholars are focused on finding the cure for the virus, but we've still got a really important role as social scientists. And our particular area of interest is to still sort of what Kirill was saying earlier, they are living through the nightmare that we began to live through back in February this year. And we can only imagine how that is panning out in some societies. And I think when you do have a little bit of insight into these particular states, you can see that it's not all the same. There are some really the divergent means of coping, and I've particularly in my own research noticed there's some very specific ways in which these states are choosing to deal with the crisis and what it's actually shining a lens on. So I think there's going to be a lot of work for social scientists to do in the aftermath of this in the years to follow. And hopefully we'll be able to be a part of that and offer some sort of contribution to anything we don't yet understand. So finally, I just want to say thank you again, and it's been a fascinating discussion. And I guess what I'll let you all know now, we've got, I'll give you the social media QR, I'll put our social media channels up just to remind you that the recording will be available on there for you. And I also just want to say a massive thank you to Learning Communities who've supported us in delivering quite a big event. And we are really grateful. They're our, we hope to do something with them again in future. So make sure you subscribe to our brand new YouTube channel. We will get this up there as soon as possible, and the Learning Communities will also put it up on their channel as well. So I just want to say thank you everyone so much for coming. We've really enjoyed having you, and we've really missed this place behind us. And we hope to do a little bit more as we're still not back on campus yet. So keep an eye on Majlis, keep an eye on the CASE Facebook page and our events, and hopefully we can continue to engage. Thank you, everyone.
Sally, thank you so much. That was excellent. And maybe we can have a follow-ups in the future. Thanks, everyone. Bye.